Jane Schoenbrun. Jane Schoenbrun, you are a visionary. A visionary. Hi, welcome back to the channel. It's Adam here, and today we are talking about one of my most anticipated movies of the year. I have been feral for this movie since it was announced. We are talking about the third feature film from Jane Schoenbrun, Teenage Sex and Death at Camp Miasma. I think Jane Schoenbrun is a visionary and one of our most distinct voices today, and this film really solidified that for me. I was enamored with I Saw the TV Glow. It was my favorite film of 2024. So going into this, my expectations were very high. On top of that hype, I love Hannah Einbinder, I love Gillian Anderson, and I love the slasher genre. So my expectations were as lofty can be, and somehow Jane Schoenbrun matched those expectations. Jane Schoenbrun is someone who is in constant conversation with the media that's shaped them and the culture at large through specific lenses of identity. With their debut feature, We're All Going to the World's Fair, we were examining online spaces and communities and the duality of isolation and community they bring. I Saw the TV Glow is a trans allegory through the lens of TV and nostalgic TV at that. I think Camp Miasma feels like their biggest swing yet. It feels like a culmination up to this point. Schoenbrun is tackling the slasher genre and is doing it like at the most maximalist I've ever seen them. But simply saying Jane Schoenbrun is tackling the slasher genre feels a little too simplistic for this film. From the opening moments, we are thrown into this richly drawn world. Jane Schoenbrun is a master at world building. I think they build these vibrant worlds that just like envelope you. But the opening credits is a montage chronicling the rise and fall of the Camp Miasma slasher franchise. Think like Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, the works. In that montage, we're cramming in images of these board game spin-offs, these degrading headlines, the ever-growing VHS tower of endless Miasma sequels, and I think we already have such a distinct, visceral idea of what this franchise's legacy is in this fictional world. We, before the movie has even started, understand how Camp Miasma functions as a legacy, as an entity in the world. But that is where Chris, played by Hannah Einbinder, comes in. She's an up-and-coming queer director who is handed this long dormant franchise in an attempt to reboot the series through fresh eyes. She is described as a Sundance wonderkind, and she is known for making a movie that is essentially a remake of Psycho from the shower curtains perspective. So this is admittedly a big leap for her in her career. She's well aware the studio wants to do it for optics, and she's very well aware of the franchise's problematic history, but she also holds a special connection to this franchise, specifically the original film. She attributes the original as being responsible for her queer awakening. In an effort to crack this story and get a new take on it, she visits Billy Presley, played by Gillian Anderson, who is the final girl from the original Miasma film. After the original Miasma film's success, Billy declined the opportunity to return for any sequels. She didn't participate in any future installments. She didn't capitalize on the fame. She retreated from the spotlight and turned into this Norma Desmond-esque recluse who now lives at the abandoned set that they used to film the original Miasma movie. It's here that fiction and reality begin to blur and delirium encroaches. I can't lie, as I was watching this movie, I kept getting a little anxious, just thinking about how am I going to even begin to unpack this movie. There's so much happening here, so I'm gonna try and break it down bit by bit. From a pure technical standpoint, I think Schoenbrun is firing on all cylinders. I think they are really pushing themselves beyond what they have achieved already as a director. Their usual visual flair is omnipresent. It's here, it's all over the place. However, it's colliding with this frenetic ambition to kind of up their game. There is a one-shot sequence in particular that really had my jaw on the floor. My eyes were lit up. It's so impressive and so marvelous to see a director push themselves like that when they haven't pulled something like that off before. I think Schoenbrun is beautifully maneuvering between these homages to slashers and their own flashy take on genre conventions, and it merges into this thing that's all its own. There are these modes where we are watching the Miasma movie, and all of those moments really mirror the aesthetic, the shots of like these movies like Sleepaway Camp and Friday the 13th. And then as we're watching, we like actually enter the movie and everything kind of shifts. Schoenbrun is also doing that like from the killer Little Death's perspective too. I think we're constantly bouncing in and out of like being a passive observer and being like immersed fully in the film. And when I say film, I mean the film within the film. I think this movie is also a major tonal pivot for the writer-director. The last two films really marinated in this existential dread, and there definitely is a heaviness still lingering beneath the surface here. There definitely is a lot of existentialism wrapped up in it, but this is so funny. This is Jane Schoenbrun's funniest movie yet, and I think it's because they embrace this self-aware campiness that allows for that humor to really flow easily. There is very much like this wink to the camera, you know, we're playing with these genre conventions, everything's very heightened, we're kind of poking fun at film culture. There was a joke about split diopters that had me giggling way after it was over. All of that is just from this embrace of camp. I think the embrace of that also allows every moment to drip with this heightened sense of sensuality. Billy and Chris have just very palpable tension there. They have these hushed monologues. They're always kind of like these tantalizing and teasing conversations, and that is very much wrapped up in Einbinder and Anderson's chemistry. The chemistry is insane. I think they send this tension into the stratosphere as they hang on every word and they're drinking in the other with these stolen glances, and I think that comes back to the camp of it all. In like these campy pieces of art, everything is felt at like a 10. So I think because we're operating in this reality of camp, we're able to experience this sensuality so like revved up. It's so sensual. It's dripping in sensuality. Like even beyond the performances or like the tone, like the sound design, specifically when we are like looking at food, is very like squelchy, erotic. There's a lot of candy on screen. There's a lot of that intertwined. I think like kind of, you know, giving in to like a desire. It's like a little sweet treat, but it's an indulgence, you know, stuff like that. While we're talking about the performances, these two are amazing together, but they're also at the top of their games individually. I think they each have a very clear understanding of what the film is trying to achieve, and they understand their respective function within it. Fresh off of the final season of Hacks, she just won an Emmy for season 4. Hannah Einbinder is giving us a much more restrained performance than we're used to seeing from her. I think, you know, obviously she blew up on Hacks with Ava, and Ava's so big all of the time, and you know, Chris is very much the opposite of that. She's timid and kind of constantly trying to shrink herself, and I think Hannah Einbinder really surrenders herself to the physicality required. She's very in her body in this, and like you can feel her like fighting with herself. However, despite the fact that she is not like a big bold personality, she's far from uninteresting, and I think the thing I love about Chris is that she is drinking in everything around her with like this intensity. She is a director, she is a writer, she is constantly mining for inspiration to put into her work. She says at one point her life has become her work, and they've kind of merged and there isn't a lot of separation, so it makes perfect sense that she's very highly attuned and kind of constantly turning gears. What Hannah Einbinder does so well is she's delivering like full monologues with just her eyes. I think we know everything that is on her mind. Chris's interiority is so detailed. All of these choices allow for Chris's journey to resonate deeper. As that arc unfolds, Einbinder eventually comes alive with this delightful tenacity, and I think that really completes the arc beautifully. You know, we've seen her unfurl Ava in a beautiful way over the course of 5 seasons. It's cool to see her like dig into a character in a condensed manner and do it so successfully. She's holding her own against Gillian Anderson, who is an icon and a legend. Anderson is working kind of in direct opposition to Chris, but she never like swallows her up. They are definitely like both equally interesting and dynamic and kind of hold the space. Obviously, Gillian Anderson's performance is a bit showier though. She is delivering every line to the back of the house in a very mesmerizing way. She is stretching every syllable like taffy with this over the top accent, affectation. She's silly, she's glamorous, but she's a bit hard to read. We really don't know like what her deal is. There's all these constant references to Norma Desmond, as I mentioned earlier, and she is like really leaning into that, but not doing a parody. It is like a character in and of itself. But it's so very clear to me that it's a persona. Billy Presley is putting on this persona. Beneath it, she's actually quite haunted by her experiences filming Camp Miasma. Beneath the theatricality that serves up a lot of comedic gold, Anderson is actually really shining in these silent moments. She has this distant, far-off gaze that transports her somewhere dark, and we can feel just how broken this woman actually is. We're going to come back to her hauntedness in a second because I do want to talk about how Jane Schoenbrun plays with artifice a lot in this. You know, like we have this idea with Billy, right, of like a persona, but Schoenbrun is also reveling in any opportunity to play with that, specifically on the visual level. It's emphasized by top-notch production design by Brandon Tonner Connolly and Matt Hyland. You know, these feel like sets, and intentionally so. This feels like a movie set, and there's no attempt made to make the painted matte backgrounds feel real. They are very obviously paintings. They're very heightened, and it is very obvious that this is not the reality of our like experience. You know, this is very much a different reality in a way. Like, we are melting cinema and reality into this surreal confection. I think the world built around these actors is really beautifully uplifting the themes at play. One at the very forefront in this instance is how art is so formative to the audience in myriad ways. What we watch and what we consume colors the way we move through the world and how we view it. And I think Schoenbrun takes that a step further with Chris and Billy and how they kind of diverge on that. Chris derived her sexual awakening from her experience watching Camp Miasma as a kid. However, Billy's experience of that same moment that clicked for Chris holds much darker memories. The experience of creating something is much different than the experience of watching that thing. And I just think that divergence is like so painful but so beautiful and so poignant. I think that's the beauty of art, specifically film. We all go into a theater together and watch the same thing, and we all arrive at it differently. We all leave it differently. Different things resonate with us. I think this is such a cool way to examine that. The movie does not stop there. The further it goes, the more intricate it gets. I don't think the screenplay is quite as tight as I Saw the TV Glow. I think that allegory like really is so airtight and works really, really well. That's not to say Camp Miasma doesn't do allegory well. That's not to say the themes aren't as rich. The screenplay is so rich. It's like a thematic buffet for audiences to dig into. It's just a little more chaotic, I think, in terms of its execution, but it really worked for me. And if you're willing to sit and marinate with it, I think you'll find it rewarding. Most obviously, this movie is engaging with the long-standing slasher genre. It's acting simultaneously as a meta-commentary, a deconstruction, and a reclamation of the genre and all its rough edges, right? The slasher genre, as we know, is rife with problematic material, whether we're discussing, you know, the hypersexualization of the women or like transphobic messaging. We tackle this so directly and cleverly throughout the film. There's one specific sequence that is like incredibly referential to 1983 Sleepaway Camp, which I think actually makes a great double feature with this, with everything we're going through thematically. If you know anything about that movie, you'll know why I'm saying that, and if you don't, look it up. It's doing all that, it's really tackling these things head on, but it also does not negate the fact that these movies are entertaining and formative. It is not shying away from that. It's holding this duality in the palm of its hand beautifully. I don't want to spoil anything, but the use of the slasher from the Miasma franchise, Little Death, played by Jack Haven, is so brilliant in the satire it is achieving. I loved it so much. Beyond the genre analysis, there's also this exploration of sexual repression and desire. I think this is where it starts to get really abstract, and some may find that a bit dizzying, but for me, I think this is actually where the film really kicks it into high gear and becomes something like super special. There is like a horniness that comes with the slasher genre. These movies are built around like sex. The slasher genre and sex have a long intertwined history. You know, when Chris and Billy are talking about the messages of the movie, Billy says like the only thing they were about was flesh and fluids. And that is a little correct to an extent. Schoenbrun really harnesses like the sexual energy that comes from the genre and the aptly named killer in this, Little Death, wink wink, to unpack fear and stigma surrounding sex. Chris mentions to Billy that Camp Miasma was their awakening, but she remains so stilted and uncomfortable when the conversation turns towards sex. There are moments where she's trying to engage in intimacy or like try to just be sexy, and she gets so in her head and in her own way, and she just shuts down. We can tie it back to shame, but I also think there's this poignancy about like the fear surrounding sex. I think specifically for queer people and women, there is a lot of fear to dismantle around intimacy. I don't think information about sex and intimacy is as accessible or readily available for young queer people. You know, not to mention there's also like this huge stigma surrounding it. You know, the AIDS epidemic drummed up a lot of fear around it. You know, I think for a lot of young women, sex is framed through this lens of like potentially violent and potentially painful as well. So the fact that our main character is a queer woman who is like really grappling with this, I think it's really profound. And this is all on top of like just the general grandiose mythologizing that happens with sex in our world already. I think people really build it up to this big thing. So like, how can you not get in your head about it? The movie acknowledges this anxiety, but it goes on to explore what happens when one embraces these deeply buried fantasies without shame. It's like, what happens when you give in to the pleasure and allow yourself to experience that pleasure and kind of confront the anxiety and the fear surrounding it? In a way, when you experience it, a piece of you is dying, but also a piece of you is like awakening from that. I think there's so much in this movie to unpack. I need to see it again, even just for the third act alone. That third act gets so dense in a beautiful way. I just love it thematically. This is turning into a very long video, but in an age when even the best slasher franchises are worn to the bone, this movie just feels like a cold blast of fresh air. You know, it's so funny to me that this movie is coming out the same year we got Scream 7, which was pretty like panned upon release. We're seeing like diminishing returns on these long popular horror franchises. But what I think Camp Miasma does so beautifully is it's lovingly winking to the slashers that paved the way, but it's not so precious about it that it can't loudly and proudly critique them for their shortcomings. It is very willing to like have a nuanced conversation. It's snuggling right up close to the tropes that shape the genre, and it immediately subverts them at every possible chance and plays with them in a beautiful way. Yet I feel like just saying this is a genre reinvention doesn't quite do it justice, because at the center of it all is something deeply personal for Schoenbrun, while also speaking to this shared experience of being impacted by film. It's brilliantly visualizing the idea of being shaped by the work we consume and how we project ourselves back onto that work and the world at large. And I think, you know, this third outing from Schoenbrun is very dense, but in a beautiful, amazing way that is like asking audiences to challenge themselves. I don't think there's a simple definition for this, and it certainly has no interest in holding your hand to get to that definition. I think Jane Schoenbrun is kind of the closest thing we have to David Lynch right now. You know, I know that's a big comparison to make, but you know, similarly, they really revel in this sense of ambiguity and aren't interested in just handing you answers. They really want you to think about it and arrive at your conclusions. You know, it's not going to be for everybody, but the result of this movie is such a rewarding resurrection of a genre that has been long thought to be stale, and it's also awakening something entirely exciting and new. I'm at a 4.5 out of 5 on this. I feel like it will go up the more I watch it. I can't believe I have to wait a month to watch it again. I know that's really spoiled of me to say, but I loved this movie so, so much. One of my favorites of the year so far. Please keep your eye on it. It comes out at the beginning of August. Thank you so much for tuning into this video. Make sure you do all the things you're supposed to do with a YouTube video. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe, share, follow me everywhere, and I will see you on the next one. Bye!